In April 2016, a press release arrived in newsrooms across Britain. It was brief, corporate in language, precise in its implications. Music Group, the parent company of Behringer, one of the largest audio manufacturers on Earth, announced that it proposed to close its loudspeaker manufacturing facility in Coatbridge, North Lanarkshire, Scotland. 70 employees. Redundant. Production to transfer to a new 3 million square foot factory in Zhongshan, China. The consultation period a matter of weeks. The facility in question had been making loudspeakers in Scotland for 40 years. Before Scotland, the same company had been making loudspeakers in South London for 30 years before that. 70 years of continuous British manufacture, ending with a press release. In a company's 90th anniversary year, that alone would be a story. But this was not just any company. 70 years earlier, in 1946, 12 months after the end of the Second World War, the editors of the Oxford English Dictionary had added a word to the English language. Not a verb derived from a place, not a scientific term, a brand name. One specific British manufacturer's brand name entered as a common noun. The definition, a communication system with loudspeakers used for making announcements in public buildings. The word also functioned as a verb, to tannoy someone, meaning to summon them by public address. The word was Tannoy. Not Hoover, though Hoover faced the same fate. Not Biro, though Biro came close. Tannoy. The voice from the ceiling at Birmingham New Street. The announcement at Heathrow Terminal 1. The morning call at Butlins Skegness. The summons to the headmaster's office. The last call for boarding. Or the name for the thing that spoke from above in every public space in Britain: school, hospital, factory, floor, football ground, railway platform for the better part of a century. And in April 2016, the company that had given that word to the English language was being told that the factory where it had been made would close. The word would remain. The factory would become housing. But the real story of Tannoy is not a press release in 2016. It is the story of what happens when a nation names something after you and then sells you quietly to people who have never heard of you. It is the story of a Yorkshire engineer in a South London garage and a Scottish factory that held a kind of knowledge that cannot be written in a manual and a speaker designed so precise that it became the instrument by which some of the greatest recordings in British music history were judged. How does a company become a word and then lose the factory that made it? If this is the kind of story you want more of, the companies that built the sound of Britain and what happened to them, subscribe. There are more of these stories. Most of them end the same way, but not all of them. Guy R. Fountain was born in Yorkshire in 1898. He came of age in a Britain that was learning for the first time what it meant to live with electricity as a domestic fact rather than an industrial novelty. The wireless radio set had arrived in British homes in the early 1920s. It arrived with a problem. The sets ran on batteries, large, heavy, expensive batteries that needed recharging, and in the London suburb of Dulwich in 1926, Fountain opened a company in a garage on Tulsamere Road to solve exactly that problem. The company was called the Tulsamere Manufacturing Company, named after the road. No ambition in the name, no declaration of intent. The kind of name you give a company when you are thinking about the problem in front of you, not the legacy behind you. Fountain made battery chargers for wireless radio sets. He was not a musician. He was not an acoustician. He was an engineer who had identified a gap between what people needed and what the market provided. That gap was his business. It would not remain his business for long. In the course of making his chargers, Fountain developed an electrolytic rectifier, a device for converting alternating current to direct current using two specific materials: tantalum, a rare metallic element with exceptional resistance to corrosion, and lead alloy. The combination worked. The device was efficient, reliable, and manufacturable at small scale. The two materials also gave him a name: tantalum, alloy, Tannoy. The abbreviation appeared in 1928. The Tannoy trademark was formally registered on the 10th of March, 1932, on which date the Tulsimere Manufacturing Company was re-registered as Guy R. Fountain Limited. The name was already on the boxes. The lightning flash logo was already on the grills. Nobody had planned for either of them to become anything more than a manufacturer's mark. Before Tannoy, British public life had no reliable mechanism for addressing large groups of people indoors. A raised voice, a bell, a megaphone in an open space. In the Britain of the late 1920s and early 1930s, a Britain of expanding factories, new municipal buildings, holiday camps, railway termini, and the gathering apparatus of mass public life. The problem of getting a message to a crowd was solved, if it was solved at all, by proximity and volume. Fountain saw it differently. If you could put a loudspeaker in a ceiling connected to a microphone at a desk, you could speak to everyone in the building at once. You could manage a factory floor. You could run a railway platform. You could wake 1,000 people on a summer morning at a holiday camp in Skegness. In 1930, Fountain secured the company's first significant contract, Bertram Mills Circus. Not a government building, not a corporation. A circus, one of the largest traveling entertainments in Britain, staging shows at Olympia in London to crowds of thousands. The challenge was exactly what Fountain had designed for large space ambient noise, the need to be heard clearly by everyone present simultaneously. Tannoy solved it. The contract established a template that the company would follow for the next 4 decades, go where sound was a problem, and solve it. Through the early 1930s, Fountain expanded into loudspeaker manufacture. He introduced his first two-way loudspeaker system in 1933. The factory moved from Dalton Road to larger premises at Canterbury Grove, London, SE 27. By the mid-1930s, Tannoy was supplying sound reinforcement for sporting events, political gatherings, and industrial sites across Britain. The equipment worked. People ordered it again. Then they recommended it to others. The Tannoy network, the invisible infrastructure of British public sound, was assembling itself site by site, grill by grill, through the simple mechanism of reliability. The Tannoy logo was always visible on the grill. In the 1930s, that was not standard practice for industrial equipment. Most electrical components were concealed behind panels inside cases invisible by design. Fountain put the name on the outside of the speaker and left it there. Every person who heard an announcement in a Tannoy-equipped building could, if they looked up, read the word. Millions of them did. Most of them did not think about it consciously. That was precisely how the word entered the language, not through advertising, not through a marketing campaign, but through repetition so complete that the brand and the thing it described became indistinguishable. The Canterbury Grove factory received a substantial government order in the spring of 1939. It was the beginning of something much larger than anyone at the company yet understood. The Second World War did not merely sustain Tannoy, it transformed it. The mechanism was straightforward. The British state needed to speak to itself at scale, across distances, in conditions where silence could cost lives, and it needed a reliable device to do so. Tannoy made that device, and it made it in sufficient quantities in sufficient locations with sufficient visibility that by the time the war ended, the word on the grill had become the word for the thing itself. Royal Air Force airfields across Britain were equipped with Tannoy public address systems, the scramble announcement, the dispersal order, the all clear, all delivered through Tannoy. Tanks and submarines carried Tannoy communication equipment. Factories across the country operating around the clock on war production received BBC broadcasts through Tannoy relay systems, the Music While You Work program, designed specifically to sustain production morale on the factory floor piped through the ceiling via Tannoy speakers. Every major British industrial site, every military base, every hospital. Treating the wounded, the voice came from above, from a grill from a box on the wall with the lightning flash logo. Then came the 8th of May, 1945. When the war in Europe ended, the announcement was made in the presence of crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace. The voice that carried across the mall, that reached the thousands who had come to hear it confirmed, passed through a Tannoy public address system. The word was already in hundreds of thousands of British minds as the name for the voice from above, the voice from the ceiling. The voice that told you something important was happening. That afternoon, on the steps of the most visible building in Britain, fixed it permanently. The Oxford English Dictionary entry came in 1946. The lexicographers were not predicting usage. They were documenting usage that had already happened, that was already so widespread and so naturalized that to exclude it from the dictionary would have been to misrepresent how the English language was actually being spoken. The definition, a communication system with loudspeakers used for making announcements in public buildings. The verb form to Tannoy entered alongside it. Fountain had not set out to put a word in the dictionary. He had set out to make a better battery charger. The dictionary entry was the consequence of solving a problem so thoroughly and so visibly that the solution replaced the description. But Fountain was not finished. In 1947, he assigned his chief engineer, Ronnie H. Rackham, to the problem that had haunted loudspeaker design since its inception. A conventional two-way speaker places a tweeter above, below, or to the side of the bass driver. The treble arrives at the listener's ear from one position in space. The bass arrives from another. The distance between the two drivers is small, sometimes a matter of inches, but the effect is audible to trained ears and measurable by instruments. At the crossover frequency where the bass driver hands the signal to the tweeter, there is a phase shift, a subtle blurring of the stereo image, a slight smearing of the boundary between notes. Every multi-driver speaker suffers from it, to some degree. The only solution was to eliminate the distance between the drivers entirely. Rackham's solution was the Dual Concentric driver, a coaxial design in which the high-frequency compression tweeter is mounted at the geometric center of a 15-inch bass cone with both voice coils sharing a single magnet assembly. Every frequency from the lowest bass register to the highest treble leaves from the same physical point in space at the same moment in the same direction. To hear the difference plainly, when you listen to a conventional speaker, the stereo image has a slight softness at its edges. Instruments sit in the mix, but their boundaries are approximate. The space between them is real, but slightly indefinite. When you listen to a dual concentric driver, the edges sharpen. The image locks. A piano sits in a specific location, not a general area. A voice occupies a precise point rather than a zone. The phase coherence, the technical term for the accuracy with which all frequencies arrive at the listening position simultaneously, is not an aesthetic preference. It is a measurable physical property, and Rackham had achieved it in a single driver in a South London factory in 1947. The new design was launched publicly at Radio Olympia in London in 1948. The first product, the Monitor Black. A 15-inch woofer, a horn-loaded compression tweeter at its center, both on a single cast frame, both energized by a single magnet. Decca Records purchased the first 6 units for studio use. AKG of Austria acquired early examples as laboratory reference instruments for microphone measurement and development. These were the most demanding listeners in the professional audio world, buying a loudspeaker made in South London to serve as their standard of accuracy. The verdict was not sentimental. It was technical. The Dual Concentric was the most phase-coherent loudspeaker commercially available. The British moat around this achievement was not primarily legal, though the dual concentric design was patented. It was practical. The tolerances required to position the compression tweeter at the precise geometric center of the base cone to maintain the flare rate of the woofer cone through the junction with the tweeter's horn, and to align both voice coil assemblies within the geometry of a single magnet, were not achievable without skilled hands-calibrated tools and institutional knowledge accumulated over production runs. Other manufacturers made coaxial speakers. A tweeter mounted concentrically with a woofer was not in principle a novel idea. What Tannoy had achieved, in practice the specific geometry of the dual concentric, the shared magnet, the point source behavior, was beyond casual replication. The difference was not theoretical, it was audible, and it was made in Britain. If you could build the most accurate loudspeaker in the world and put your name on it and sell it to every recording studio and broadcast facility in Britain, what would you do next? The Monitor Black became the Monitor Red in 1958. The Monitor Red became the Monitor Gold in 1967. Each iteration refined, the driver improved power handling. Extended frequency response tightened the tolerances on the magnet assembly without altering the fundamental geometry that Rackham had established in 1947. The point source principle remained. The phase coherence remained. What changed was the precision with which the original idea was executed and the breadth of the professional world that came to depend on it. By the mid-1950s, almost every major British recording studio had installed Tannoy monitors. The list was not a marketing claim. It was a roster of institutional adoption so consistent that it constituted a professional consensus. Decca Records had been there from the beginning. The first 6 Monitor Blacks purchased in 1948 deployed in Decca's studios for the monitoring of what would become some of the most technically celebrated classical recordings of the century. The Decca Tree, a stereo microphone technique developed by the Decca engineering team in the early 1950s, using 3 microphones in a specific triangular arrangement to capture orchestral width and depth, produced recordings that were monitored through Tannoy dual concentrics. The spatial information in those recordings, the width and depth of the orchestral image that made Decca's classical catalog a reference standard for decades, was judged on Tannoy speakers. If the image sounded right on the Tannoy, it was right. The BBC came next. Tannoy monitors were adopted across BBC Studios radio and television as the broadcast standard through the 1950s and into the 1960s. The sound of the BBC, the specific sonic character of British public broadcasting that reached tens of millions of listeners, was shaped in rooms where the reference monitor was a Tannoy dual concentric. The engineers who set levels, who balanced orchestras, who mixed drama productions and news programs and light entertainment made those judgments through Tannoy speakers. The standard they were holding to was a Tannoy standard. Then there was Joe Meek. In 1962, the independent producer and recording engineer Joe Meek, working in his self-built studio above a leather goods shop at 304 Holloway Road, North London, described his monitoring setup in terms that were for the time entirely unremarkable in their specificity. The speaker, he said, was a Tannoy dual concentric in a Lockwood cabinet, the type they used in most studios at the time. Meek's comment was not an endorsement. It was a statement of the obvious. By 1962, a Tannoy dual concentric in a Lockwood cabinet was what a British studio had. It was the baseline. It was what you started with before you considered anything else. The Lockwood cabinet deserves a moment's attention because it was part of the story in a way that is easily overlooked. Tannoy, in its Monitor series, years manufactured the drive units, only the driver itself. The cone, the magnet assembly, the concentric tweeter. The cabinet was not Tannoy's product. It was made by Lockwood Musical Instruments, based in Chingford, East London. Lockwood built enclosures specifically designed around Tannoy's 15-inch drivers, the Lancaster, the Major, the Minor, in carefully calculated volumes and with precisely cut ports tuned to the driver's acoustic characteristics. The partnership was not formal, it was practical. Engineers knew that a Tannoy driver in a Lockwood cabinet was the combination. The two companies never merged. They never needed to. The market understood the pairing without being told. EMI's Abbey Road followed a slightly more complicated path. Studio 2. The room where most of the significant work happened, the room that had recorded Cliff Richard and the Shadows, and would go on to record the Beatles, used Altec 605A monitors as its primary reference through the 1960s. The Altec was an American coaxial design, respected and trusted by the engineers who had grown up with it. When EMI installed Tannoy monitor Golds in Studio 2 in late 1968, mounted in Lockwood Lancaster cabinets replacing the Altecs, the transition was not seamless. Jeff Emmerich, the engineer most closely associated with the Beatles' recording sessions, found the Tannoy's extended, high-frequency response difficult to calibrate to after years with the Altecs. He continued to use the older monitors for specific sessions when he could. The Tannoys, he felt, were too revealing. They showed too much too accurately, and a mix that sounded balanced on the Tannoys could sound harsh on the domestic equipment most listeners owned. This was not a criticism of the Tannoy. It was a description of its precision. A monitor that tells the truth is only useful if the engineer has learned to interpret the truth it tells. Emmerich's preference for the Altecs was the preference of a craftsman for the tool he had learned on. It did not diminish what the Tannoy was. It illustrated it. What happened in Studio 2 in 1972 and 1973, after the Tannoy monitor Golds had been in place for 4 years and the engineers had learned to listen through them, was a different matter entirely. Roger Waters arrived at Abbey Road in the spring of 1972 with a set of recordings that Pink Floyd had been developing on the road for the better part of a year. The album they were building, The Dark Side of the Moon, was unlike anything the studio had been asked to document before, not in its instrumentation or its structure, but in its spatial ambition. Waters and the band were working with stereo as a compositional element, not merely a technical format. Sounds moved, voices crossed, synthesized tones drifted from one side of the listening field to the other and back. The cash register at the opening of Money. The heartbeat that opened and closed the entire record. The voices in Brain Damage, present, then distant, then inside the room. The spatial architecture of the album was as deliberate as its harmonic architecture. And that spatial architecture had to be judged on something. It was judged on the Tannoy monitor Golds in Lancaster cabinets in Studio 2. The Dual Concentric driver's point source design means that when Roger Waters placed a voice at a specific position in the stereo field of Studio 2's mix position. In 1972, the monitor Golds showed him exactly where it was. Not an approximation of where it was. Not a slightly blurred image of where it was. The precise point. The spatial architecture of The Dark Side of the Moon. The specific locations of sounds within the stereo field that made the album feel on headphones and on speakers alike like an experience occurring inside the listener's head rather than in front of them, was built on British monitoring precision. The speakers were not incidental to the sound. They were the instrument of judgment by which every decision about that sound was verified. The Dark Side of the Moon was released in March 1973. It entered the Billboard 200 and remained on that chart continuously for 937 weeks. It is one of the best-selling albums in recorded history. The reviews noted its ambition, its coherence, its sonic depth. None of them mentioned the monitors in Studio 2. None of them were expected to. The Tannoy Monitor Gold was the kind of instrument whose contribution to a recording is invisible precisely because it is doing its job correctly. A speaker that tells the truth leaves no fingerprints. The truth is all that remains. What happened in the wider culture during these same years was a parallel story running on a different track, but heading in the same direction. While the Monitor Gold was becoming the reference standard of the British recording studio, a different Tannoy was operating at the other end of the social spectrum entirely, and doing so with a completeness that no marketing department could have engineered. At Butlins in Skegness and Filey and Clacton, the morning began with a Tannoy. "Good morning, campers." The voice from the speaker above the chalet door, calling the holiday to order. At Birmingham New Street and Paddington and King's Cross, the platform alteration was announced over the Tannoy. At Wembley Stadium and Highbury and Old Trafford, the team sheets were read over the Tannoy. At St. Bartholomew's Hospital and the Royal Free and Manchester Royal Infirmary, the consultant was paged over the Tannoy. At every secondary school in Britain, the headmaster's summons arrived over the Tannoy. The word had by the early 1970s achieved something that no brand name achieves. Through effort, it had become transparent. People did not say the Tannoy, meaning the Tannoy system made by the company of that name. They said the Tannoy the way they said the stairs, or the door, as a feature of the built environment so familiar as to be beneath notice. The company's intellectual property department had by this point begun the thankless task of writing to publications and broadcasters to remind them that Tannoy was a registered trademark, not a generic term, and should be capitalized accordingly. The BBC received such a letter. So did several national newspapers. The letters were politely acknowledged. The lowercase usage continued. This is the paradox that sits at the center of the Tannoy story, and it is worth holding for a moment before moving forward. The company had achieved what every manufacturer claims to want: total brand recognition, a name so associated with a category of product that the two had become synonymous in the public mind. And that achievement was simultaneously the company's greatest commercial problem. A word that belongs to everyone belongs to no one. A trademark that the public treats as a common noun is a trademark that is perpetually at risk of being ruled a common noun, stripped of its legal protection, surrendered to the language, leaving the company with a name, but without the legal right to own it exclusively. Tannoy fought this battle for decades. It is still fighting it. The word is still in the dictionary. The factory is not still in Scotland. Through the late 1960s and into the 1970s, the prestige range extended Tannoy's reach into the domestic hi-fi market. The Westminster, the York Minster, the Arden, the Cheviot. Large floor-standing speakers built around dual concentric drivers in enclosures of carefully calculated volume, bringing the monitoring standard of the professional studio into the British living room. These were not cheap instruments. A pair of Tannoy Ardens in the mid-1970s represented a significant investment for a domestic listener, several £100 at a time, when the average British weekly wage was under £60. The buyers were engineers, musicians, serious listeners, who had encountered Tannoy in a professional context and wanted to replicate that experience at home. They were buying access to the truth that the studios used. At its peak, a pair of Tannoy Monitor Golds in Lockwood Lancaster cabinets positioned in a specialist hi-fi dealer on Tottenham Court Road in the mid-1970s occupied a specific kind of authority in the room. The cabinets were floor-standing, walnut-veneered, the gold anodized chassis of the driver visible through the grille cloth. The driver itself, the 15-inch cone, the concentric tweeter at its center, the single magnet assembly the tolerances held by hand at the Canterbury Grove factory, was not a product you explained. It was a product you demonstrated. The experienced salesman knew to put on a record and step back. The speaker did not flatter the recording. It reported it. Listeners either understood immediately what that meant, or they went back to the flattering speakers and the comfortable approximation. The ones who understood became Tannoy customers for life. By the mid-1970s, Tannoy's international reach had extended far beyond the British recording studio and the British living room. The Sydney Opera House, the Hong Kong Convention Center, the United Nations headquarters in Paris, Geneva, and New York, the London Palladium. These were not marketing placements. They were institutional choices made by acoustic engineers who had evaluated the available options and selected Tannoy as the standard against which others were measured. The British standard had become the global institutional standard. Guy Fountain, working in a South London garage on a battery charger problem in 1926, had produced through the logic of engineering, precision applied consistently over 5 decades, the most trusted name in public sound on Earth. In 1974, he retired. He was 76 years old. He had run the company for 48 years. What happened next is a different kind of story. It is the story that the Monitor Gold and the morning announcement at Butlins had been quietly postponing the story of what British precision manufacturing looks like when the people who built it step away, and the people who replace them have never heard the difference. Harman International Industries was an American company. It made audio equipment, professional amplifiers, consumer hi-fi loudspeakers, and it was run by Sidney Harman, an engineer and businessman who understood the audio industry well enough to have built a substantial one. When Harman acquired Tannoy in 1974, the purchase was not irrational. A prestigious British monitor manufacturer with a patented driver design and a client list that included every major British recording studio was a credible asset for a company in the professional audio business. The acquisition made sense on paper. What it did in practice was end the era of Tannoy as an independent British manufacturer. Guy Fountain left. The man who had named the company after the alloy in his battery chargers, who had assigned Ronnie Rackham to the problem that became the Dual Concentric, who had watched his brand name enter the Oxford English Dictionary while he was still running the factory that produced it, that man was gone. The institutional memory that resided in a founder does not transfer with the purchase price. It retires with him. The second consequence of the Harman acquisition was geographical. In 1976, Tannoy's manufacturing operations were relocated from Canterbury Grove, London, NC27, to Coatbridge, North Lanarkshire, Scotland. The rationale was operational production efficiency, cost reduction, the logic of consolidating facilities. The effect was the permanent end of London manufacture. The workers at Canterbury Grove, the men and women who had been assembling dual concentric drivers to Rackham's tolerances, who knew by hand what the correct tension felt like, who could hear in the finished product whether the geometry was right, either relocated to Scotland or did not. Many did not. Their knowledge did not relocate with the equipment. In Canterbury Grove, SE27, a street was later named after what had stood there. Tannoy Square. A plaque on the curb. The only physical evidence that anything was ever made on that ground. The Coatbridge factory inherited the production. It inherited the tooling, the specifications, the drawings. It did not immediately inherit the accumulated craft knowledge of a workforce that had been building the same driver for nearly 30 years. That knowledge had to be rebuilt, worker by worker, production run by production run, in a new town, in a new country. It could be rebuilt. It was rebuilt. But the process took time, and during that time the production was not the production that Canterbury Grove had been producing. The collector market decades later would render its verdict on the difference between pre-move and post-move examples with the precision of a balance sheet. Then, in 1977, Sidney Harman accepted an appointment in the Carter administration as Under-Secretary of Commerce. American law at the time required government appointees to divest their direct business interests. Harman sold his company. The whole of Harman International Tannoy included to Beatrice Foods of Chicago. The sale price was $100 million. Beatrice Foods was one of the largest conglomerates in America. It owned Tropicana orange juice. It owned Samsonite luggage. It owned Krispy Kreme. It owned at various points more than 200 separate companies across the consumer goods landscape. Tannoy was one of them, a loudspeaker manufacturer in Coatbridge, Scotland, making precision studio monitors for recording engineers and high-end domestic speakers for serious listeners, was within the Beatrice Foods portfolio a rounding error. Not a strategic asset, not a priority. A line in a spreadsheet that needed to show a return in a division that nobody at the Chicago headquarters had the knowledge or the inclination to manage with any sophistication. The Beatrice period lasted 4 years. What it produced in terms of active mismanagement is difficult to document. Precisely the decisions that were not made, the investments that were not committed. The product development that did not happen are harder to trace than the decisions that were made. What is documentable is the outcome. When the hi-fi market contracted in the early 1980s and Beatrice Foods decided to exit its audio holdings. Tannoy's working directors, the managers who had been running the company day to day while Chicago held the ownership, organized a management buyout. In 1981, they purchased Tannoy back from Beatrice Foods. This was the most British possible response to the situation. The people who actually knew how to make the thing bought it back from the people who had never understood what it was. They returned the company to British control. They continued manufacturing in Coatbridge. In 1982, they launched the Prestige domestic range, the Sterling the Kensington, the Arden the Westminster, bringing the Dual Concentric driver to a new generation of domestic listeners at prices that reflected the precision of what was inside the cabinet. For a decade, the story appeared to have found its resolution. A British company run by British managers making British speakers in Scotland, selling them to the world. If the people who knew how to make the thing could buy it back and keep making it, why was that never going to be enough? Because the economics of precision craft manufacturing in Britain in the 1980s were not the economics of 1948 or 1958 or 1967. The dual concentric driver required skilled assembly, the tolerances of the concentric magnet structure, the positioning of the compression tweeter at the geometric center of the base cone, the alignment of the two voice coil assemblies within the single magnet, the flare rate maintained through the junction were not achievable by unskilled labor. Working from a manual, they required workers who had learned the process by doing it, who had internalized the feel of a correctly assembled driver, who could hear in the finished product whether the geometry was right. Those workers existed in Coatbridge in 1981. They were the same workers broadly who had come through the relocation from London 5 years earlier, or who had been trained by those workers in the intervening period. They were not young. And the conditions that would reproduce them, the apprenticeship schemes, the technical college courses in precision engineering, the industrial infrastructure that had trained the Canterbury Grove workforce in the first place, were in the Britain of the early 1980s contracting. This is Force 4 in the Tannoy story, and it is the least visible of the forces that shaped the company's decline precisely because it accumulates without announcement. No press release marks the moment when the last worker who learned the dual concentric assembly process from Ronnie Rackham's original team retires. No board meeting records the decision not to replace him with someone trained to the same standard. The knowledge simply becomes rarer year by year, until one day it is gone, and the people managing the company are not certain exactly when it left. In 1987, Tannoy merged with Goodman's, a British loudspeaker manufacturer whose own history carried the marks of corporate disruption and ownership change that had become the common pattern of British audio manufacturing in the post-war decades. The merged entity was called Tannoy Goodman's International, or TGI. The rationale was scale 2, British loudspeaker makers combining their distribution networks, their manufacturing capacity, their product ranges to compete more effectively in a market that was becoming increasingly international and increasingly price-sensitive. The Coatbridge factory continued, the Dual Concentric range continued, the Prestige series continued. TGI traded through the 1990s with the particular kind of determined competence that characterizes British manufacturing companies in the years before their final acquisition, doing the work, holding the standard, aware that the world around them was changing in ways that their balance sheet could not indefinitely resist. In 2002, TGI was acquired by TC Group. TC Group was a Danish company best known as the parent of TC Electronic, a manufacturer of studio signal processing equipment, reverbs and delays, and pitch correctors well regarded in the professional audio world based in Aarhus. TC Group was not a conglomerate in the Beatrice Foods sense. It understood audio. It understood the professional market. Under TC Group ownership, Tannoy expanded into commercial sound reinforcement, launched the Reveal series of studio monitors, smaller active affordable near-field speakers aimed at the project studio market, and maintained the Prestige range as the flagship of the brand. The Coatbridge factory continued to operate. By some accounts, the TC Group years were a period of relative stability. But stability is not the same as security. And the ownership of TC Group was itself subject to the same forces that had swept through the British audio industry since the 1970s. In 2015, TC Group was acquired by Music Group, a company controlled by the entrepreneur Uli Berenger, subsequently rebranded as Music Tribe. Music Tribe's portfolio included Berenger, the world's largest manufacturer of low-cost audio equipment, with production centered on a vast factory complex in Zhongshan, China. It also included Midas Turbosound, Clark Technic, British professional audio brands, each with their own history of craft manufacturing, each now operating within a corporate structure whose competitive advantage was derived from the economics of Chinese mass production. Tannoy was the latest addition to that portfolio, and the logic that had made Music Tribe profitable volume low, cost centralized production was not compatible with a Scottish factory making small quantities of high-margin precision speakers by hand. The announcement came in April 2016. Music Group proposed to close the Coatbridge facility. 70 employees redundant. Loudspeaker production to transfer to Music Group's new 3 million square foot manufacturing plant in Zhongshan. Research development and marketing activities to relocate to Music Group's Innovation Centre in Manchester. The consultation period opened. The GMB Scotland trade union raised objections. A spokesperson for the union told journalists that senior managers at the Coatbridge plant had been placed on gardening leave and had their email access blocked. Workers were being urged to sign individual redundancy agreements ahead of the proposed closure date of March 2017. The union's assessment was direct. The factory was being run down, not restructured. In the months that followed, the public narrative became complicated. Music Group announced in late 2016 that Prestige range production would continue in Scotland, a reprieve of a kind for the flagship domestic speaker line. The announcement was received with cautious relief by the hi-fi press. Then the details emerged. The reprieve was partial. The scale was reduced. The 70 skilled engineering positions were not being restored. The factory that had operated for 40 years was not being returned to its former capacity. It was being wound down in stages rather than closed in one action, which is a different thing from being saved. The GMB Scotland assessment proved accurate. In the years that followed, the Coatbridge workforce contracted to a fraction of its 2015 level. Cabinet manufacturing, the physical construction of the enclosures that housed the dual concentric drivers, moved offshore. The site's landlord, Paloma Capital, submitted planning applications for the redevelopment of the factory land. The proposal 60 homes, a mixture of flats and detached houses, a drainage pond green space. The building where Tannoy had made speakers for 44 years would be demolished. The homes would be built on the footprint of the factory floor. The last batch was assembled in Coatbridge. There was no announcement for that either. The tooling was catalogued. The remaining workforce signed their papers. The building stood empty for a period. Then the planning applications moved forward. 60 houses, a drainage pond, 44 years of dual concentric assembly, 70 skilled engineers. The knowledge they carried, the feel of the correctly positioned tweeter, the sound of a driver assembled to tolerance gone with them when they left. The name remained on the products. The name is always the last thing to go. The Tannoy name continues. Products bearing it are listed on a website available for purchase, shipped from a distribution network that spans several continents. The Prestige range, the Westminster, the Kensington, the Sterling, the Arden, remains in the catalog. Where the cabinets are built and by whom and to what specification, and whether the hands that assemble the dual concentric driver in 2026 carry the institutional knowledge that the hands in Coatbridge carried in 1985 are questions to which clear and publicly verifiable answers do not exist. The company does not volunteer the information. The hi-fi press has noted the absence. The secondary market has not waited for clarification. It has rendered its verdict with the precision it always applies to these questions, the precision of completed transactions. A Tannoy monitor, gold 15-inch driver in working condition in its original Lockwood Lancaster cabinet, listed on eBay UK or Reverb. In 2024 sells for between £2,000 and £5,000, depending on condition and provenance. A matched pair in exceptional condition with documentation has achieved more at specialist auction. The Tannoy monitor, red, the predecessor to the gold manufactured between 1958 and 1967, commands similar figures. The monitor black, the original 1948 design, the first production dual concentric, is rarer and priced accordingly. Against these numbers, a new Tannoy Prestige speaker from the current range, whatever its merits, does not compete on the secondary market. The collector is not buying the name. The collector is buying the object. The object that was made in Canterbury Grove and in Coatbridge by workers who had learned the process from people who had learned it before them, in an unbroken chain of craft knowledge that ran from Ronnie Rackham's drawing board in 1947 to the last assembly line in Scotland. That chain is broken now. The collector market understands this. It prices accordingly. The Lockwood cabinet is itself a secondary market object. Built in Chingford, East London, by a company that no longer exists, to enclosure volumes calculated specifically for Tannoy's 15-inch drivers. The original Lockwood Lancaster and major cabinets are sought independently of the drivers they were built to house. Specialist dealers in South London and the home counties, the same geography that produced the original instruments, trade in original Lockwood cabinets as standalone items. The partnership that never needed to be formalized because the market understood it without being told has in the secondary market become more valuable precisely because neither company exists any longer to make new examples. The British collector community gathers at the London Audio Show and the Bristol Hi-Fi Show, the two annual events where vintage Tannoy finds its most concentrated audience. The people who attend are not primarily young. They are engineers in their 50s and 60s who encountered Tannoy in a professional context in the 1970s and 1980s and have spent the intervening decades trying to recreate at home what they heard in a studio control room. They are musicians who remember the specific quality of the monitoring environment in which they recorded their best work. They are listeners who cannot fully articulate what they are hearing when they listen to a monitor gold, but who know with certainty that they are not hearing the same thing from a modern equivalent, however well measured, however well reviewed, however well priced. What they are hearing, and what they cannot hear from the modern equivalent, is not audiophile mythology. It is measurable physics. The monitor gold used alnico magnets, an alloy of aluminium, nickel, and cobalt in its driver assembly. Alnico has a specific BH curve, a specific relationship between magnetic field strength and flux density that produces a particular motor behavior at the voice coil. The voice coil moves in a slightly different way under an alnico magnet than it moves under the ferrite magnets used in modern production. The difference is subtle. It is consistent. It is audible to trained ears and measurable by instruments. It affects the way the driver handles transients, the sharp leading edges of sounds, the attack of a piano note, the initial crack of a snare drum, and it affects the way the high-frequency compression tweeter integrates with the bass cone at the crossover point. The result is a character in the high-frequency reproduction that modern dual concentric drivers built with ferrite magnets and updated motor structures do not fully replicate. This is not a flaw in the modern driver. It is a difference. The collector market has decided which side of that difference it prefers. Session engineers in London still rent original monitor golds for specific tasks, not out of sentiment, not out of nostalgia, out of the same professional calculation that led Decca Records to buy the first 6 monitor blacks. In 1948, the calculation that the most accurate available tool produces the most accurate available result, and that for certain tasks in certain rooms, the most accurate available tool is still a speaker built in a factory that no longer exists. At Canterbury Grove, London, SE 27, there is a road called Tannoy Square, a small plaque, a street name on a curb in a residential neighborhood in South London. The factory that made the Monitor Blacks and the Monitor Reds before the move to Scotland in 1976 is gone. The ground where the Canterbury Grove factory stood is built over. The plaque is the only physical evidence that anything was ever made there. Most of the people who live on Tannoy Square do not know what the street is named after. Some of them, if asked, would say they'd heard of it. Heard the word rather without being certain where they'd heard it, which is in a way the most accurate possible summary of what Tannoy achieved and what it lost. In Coatbridge, North Lanarkshire, there is no Tannoy Square. No plaque has been announced. The planning applications for 60 homes on the factory site have moved through the local authority process. The building that housed 44 years of dual concentric production, the Monitor Golds, the HPD series, the Prestige range, the speakers that monitored The Dark Side of the Moon and the Blade Runner soundtrack, and the classical recordings that defined what high fidelity meant to a generation of British listeners, is scheduled for demolition. The drainage pond and the green space and the mix of flats and detached houses will occupy the footprint of the factory floor. The road through the development will have a name. It has not yet been announced what that name will be. Here is the detail that the story does not quite know what to do with, and so tends to leave out. The Oxford English Dictionary entry for tannoy, lowercase generic, the common noun that the company never intended to create and has spent decades trying to legally prevent, remains in the dictionary. It was added in 1946. It has not been removed. The Longman Dictionary of Current English lists it. The Collins English Dictionary lists it. In February 2010, a BBC World Service broadcast used the word to describe the loudspeakers being used to warn coastal communities in Chile to evacuate to higher ground following the earthquake that had struck that morning. The BBC received a letter from Tannoy's intellectual property department. The usage continued. The word outlives the factory. The word may outlive the product. The word entered the language because a Yorkshire engineer in a South London garage solved a problem so thoroughly and so visibly that the solution replaced the description. The language absorbed it and kept it the way language keeps everything that proves useful enough, without permission, without payment, without acknowledgement of where it came from. When a brand becomes a word, who owns the word, the company, or the language, Tannoy did not decline because its products became inferior. It did not decline because British taste changed, or because a Japanese competitor offered a better speaker at a lower price, or because the technology the dual concentric driver represented was superseded by something more advanced. It declined because the logic of successive corporate acquisition, American in 1974, American again in 1977, recovered by its own managers, in 1981 merged in 1987. Danish in 2002. Malaysian registered in 2015 applied to a craft-based precision manufacturing operation. The same calculation it applies to everything volume margin location. Each acquisition was rational within its own terms. Each one moved the company one step further from the circumstances that had produced the dual concentric driver and the word in the dictionary. The distance accumulated. By 2016, it had become a factory closure notice. By 2020, it had become a housing development application. The dual concentric driver is still in production in some form. The question of whether the object in the box and the name on the box still refer to the same thing, whether the tolerances are held, whether the geometry is exact, whether the knowledge that Ronnie Rackham put into a design in 1947 is still present in the hands that assemble the driver today, is one that the collector market, the session engineer, and the retired Coatbridge assembly worker have each already answered in their own way, without waiting to be asked. A pair of monitor golds still in their Lockwood Lancaster cabinets in a mastering studio in Bermondsey, South London, 4 miles from the garage in Dulwich, where Guy Fountain began, driven by a British valve amplifier. The woofer cone and the tweeter aligned at the same point in space, the same geometry Ronnie Rackham drew in 1947, the same phase relationship, the same British precision doing exactly what it was always designed to do, making the sound tell the truth. If you want to hear more stories about the British manufacturers who built the sound of a century, subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.